everybody. Welcome back to the Brand on Joe podcast. Our guest for today's episode is Jennifer Holland. She received her master's degree in IO psychology from the CUNY School of Professional Studies and currently works at NICCO Strategy as an organizational effectiveness strategy consultant. Welcome, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, no, yeah. We're just glad you wanted to talk with us. But before we get started into your background in IO, before the recording, we were talking about that you're located in New York and you actually take part in a Metro that we've kind of brought up a couple of times on this podcast. How'd you get started in that? Because it's such a great resource for any IO student to have, to just be located right in the center of New York.
Yeah, it took me a while to come across Metro. I think I had attended this PSYOP conference, and they had pointed to resource pages that I wasn't aware of. And Metro was one of the associations listed. And so I started to attend the events, and they're so wonderful, very educational. The people who speak are always so well informed researchers. You're always going to learn something. Excellent crowd. There's a lot of people who come from a Hofstra background. So yeah, I just so happen to know a lot of people from Hofstra.
We always represent there. There's always so many Hofstra students.
Very largely represented. But yeah, and then I started to volunteer there. And so I've been to a lot of the events, and it's been awesome.
For Metro, I feel like we've heard them kind of describe it as like a mini PSYOP kind of. I know because PSYOP is this huge global scale, but Metro, you kind of get that same feel, but just for those New Yorkers. I guess other people can come, but I know it's just centered in New York. Mm-hmm. Would you say it's a great kind of resource for those students to have? Because I know in our first year during our program, they were you have to go. We got you guys all these memberships to come, and you can meet so many great people.
I'd take it a step further and say there's a professional development level to it. I've been to some of the events, then they've been hosted kind of workshops where they try to make them interactive and give us a data thing to look at. And, it's just really great to hear from the audience members, which is a diverse crowd of well-established professionals in the field. And there are some students sprinkled in. So it's just a really great community, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I know Joe and I attended a lot of those sessions, and I believe the one you're talking about was the data storytelling session where they had all of those different answers. We talked about this before in the podcast, but everybody talked about the stuff they did, and everyone came up with different answers when interpreting the data. I thought it was super interesting because you're talking about students looking at this, professionals looking at this, researchers, and everybody still looking at it and coming out with a different outcome. So I've found value in it as a student. I can only imagine what other students who are just getting into the field will also find too.
Yeah, I have yet to go to an event and say it wasn't worth my time or that I didn't learn a lot. I always leave with a lot to think about. There's always just a varying difference of opinions and outlooks and lenses that people are looking at, because as you know, IO psychology, it's so broad. So you have people that are practicing in different areas of it, and that, or while we all are trained to look at things from a research standpoint, right? You still also have the expertise of the hands-on experience in the different segments of the field that come to the table as well, and that's so fruitful.
Yeah, and I want to add one more point to that too. When we're talking about getting the value out of it, we bring up on this podcast a lot the value of networking. And just because you're not in the New York area doesn't mean that your area doesn't offer something. Mm-hmm. So be on the lookout for opportunities to network and meet other people, because when we use Metro as that type of almost practice for PSYOP, and it's great. It's a great opportunity, and you meet a lot of established people. But now we can kind of use that to kind of talk about a little bit of the work that you're doing. And as somebody who is working at Metro and helping out with Metro, you obviously have an established background in IO. So can we kind of talk about a little bit the work you're doing? Joe and I were interested in having you on this podcast specifically for the title that you have. So as Joe kind of mentioned, an organizational effectiveness strategy consultant. So for our listeners out there, could you kind of explain what that is and what a day in the life of work looks like?
Yeah, sure. I kind of fell into org effectiveness. I remember, through my studies, org development was kind of it for me. I loved it because it meshed my business background with IO psychology, and that's kind of what made IO psychology the it thing for me. Um, and so I really, really love it. It's so broad, just like psychology. You have issues that you can dive into. You're constantly digging for something, and so that's the thing that I love about it. I fell into it in higher education, actually. The college that I was working for wanted to take a different approach to the institutional research customary, office that they had, where it's mostly based on just data analysis and kind of like reporting, but on a basic level, and take it a step further to include the assessment components and actually storytelling and giving a bigger picture of things that were going on within the organization. And so I was fruitful. It was very fruitful my employment time there. But I want to state that it started with job crafting. So, that's something that we learn in IO studies, right? And so any opportunity that you have to start job crafting and shape any role that you have into another one, I'd say go for it. If you see org needs, if you see issues, if you see things that require a systems thinking approach, go for it. But org effectiveness is pretty much taking on that systems thinking approach, right? And giving the leaders a holistic picture of what's going on and how the areas within the organization interconnect and what that impact looks like, right? There's a lot of times where there's some really great ideas, leaders mean well, but they kind of don't have a sense of how changing one thing impacts other things and how critical communication plans and building trust and priming before implementing changes are. So those are the kinds of things that I help org leaders recognize, that you can't just throw a change in. You have to kind of like measure where people are, what else it impacts, and get that fuller picture. So, depending on the project, my day could look very, very different. And that's really what I love about it.
So one thing I wanted to ask, or I guess to clarify. So when you say talking about job crafting,
Mm-hmm.
that's actually a topic that we haven't brought up on our podcast yet. But it is something that is important in IO. When you say job crafting, was that something that you did on your end to help you end up in this career, or was that something that you started working on and working with?
Both. I When I learned about it, I loved it. So for those who haven't come across it yet, it's basically when you create your own role, your own job description, and responsibilities and duties based on the needs of the organization. A lot of times, because they don't have that IO training, they don't know the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are necessary to get things done that need to get done. And so when you start to apply your studies as you go along the way, you're going to start to recognize those things more and more in your current role. So it doesn't even matter what you're doing, because IO psychology is so broad and we're trained in areas ranging from HR to org development to training and development. We're trained in so many areas that you kind of just start to lean towards something. And I know a lot of students or new practitioners, they struggle with finding their thing, right? Because you have so many ways that you can go with it. And HR is like the most highly pitched, but it's not the only direction. And I love how a lot of the people in my current network on LinkedIn have been promoting some of the roles that are available. And so it's basically doing that. Like you see a problem within your organization, you work with senior leaders, you put yourself out there a bit, you pitch it, you learn how to gain that buy-in. And because you know your stuff and you gain that confidence in knowing your stuff, and you as a trained researcher, before you even go in for buy-in, you're gonna already have collected data in your mind that'll be something that you have readily available to dive a little bit deeper into and pull like industry data and research and tie it into a presentation or something of the sort. And as you do that more and more, they'll realize that there's a need for a particular role within the organization, and it can actually lead to that, especially if they value you in the organization, or they value what that need, filling that need means, right? So that's pretty much what job crafting is. And I recommend everyone look for opportunities in that. If you're a student or you're a new practitioner and you're just trying to find your role, it may actually be where you are.
You brought up a great point about just being an IO, that like the amount of things that you can just do for an organization and in the field in general. We talk about it a lot on this podcast. Uh, not trying to convince students, but trying to show them the world out there, because it can be tough being a student, be like, what do I do? And there really is so much that you can do. But when you were talking about your work in OD, I wanted to ask, because you talk about working with data and having to implement changes and talking with these leaders to implement those changes. When you receive feedback from these leaders or concerns that they don't want to make these changes, even though as an IO, you kind of see the data laid out and you see it's probably one of the better solutions, how do you kind of overcome that hump? How do you like almost convince them and say, I really think we should do this, and this is kind of like what I see?
Pushback. So working in academia, I encountered a lot of pushback, because these are people with PhDs, highly trained professionals in different areas. And so research is something that they want you to bring to the table, and so I had been fortunate in experiencing a lot of pushback, right? Like I literally was like the littlest man in the room, quote unquote, many of the times, which is fortunate, but at times it's very intimidating because you don't know if you're going to be taken seriously. So I started off very timid, and I got turned away many times where where some said, okay, you have to come back with more research. Like we know you may know this stuff, but come back. I had to do lit reviews at times for presentations. Like I had to really learn to back my stuff. And then I had to sometimes back it again after gaining the buy-in. So you have to have a lot of patience, and you're gonna have resistance to change. I actually ended up doing my master thesis paper on my organization, and it was on resistance to change. And so I developed a survey that I had used a portion of a already crafted survey that was like well researched and backed, and I had implemented some resistance measures into it. And that totally freaked me out because then I was told, oh, you put other stuff in, so now you have to test your own survey. So I added an additional layer to myself that it made it very difficult. But the point is that you do have to measure resistance sometimes. So you're gonna get it. Change is hard for a lot of people. Sometimes it's just they think the norms work. They don't quite see the bigger picture. Other times there's personal objectives in mind where, what works for them in particular, even though it doesn't work for the organization at large, right? It may work for a particular department or just be the way they like to do things, right? So you have many reasons for resistance. So you really have to learn the people that are involved, how it connects with what they're doing, and find that sweet spot for them so that they can be on board. Collaboration is extremely critical to any change management process.
Before we go into the change management side that you're talking about, I wanted to go back to the point you made, Jennifer, about like showing your work basically, because that's a little bit contrary to a lot of the points that I've heard from like some of the professors that I talk to about like deprogramming grad students when they come into work. So was that something where you had to like show your resources and show the research, or was it more of just kind of conducting and giving and storytelling with that data like we kind of talk about?
Both. And for me that was a lot because I know exactly what you speak of. And if I'm correct, pretty much my first org development class, they said if the client is not on board, abandon the project. You will not be able to implement that change. And that kind of stuck with me. And as I got more pushback and I got to see how pushback can really delay a project or make you nearly start from scratch at times, I began to really understand that, like it's not about controversy. It's not about not wanting to face the pushback and not recognizing that you will get it. It's more about, trust. If your organization doesn't trust that what you are putting in place is for the betterment of the organization. If you find yourself having to prove too much, you're going to take forever to get there. Pretty much there was trust put in, but there was so many people involved in a lot of the projects that, sometimes it just took longer than it really, really needed to. And so at those points in time, you kind of got to decide whether it's time to just move on to the next, big thing in your life. And so that was it for me. You do all you can, right? You do all you can. You make some big changes. You had some highlights that you can highlight about your time there. You grew, you learned. But at every point, for everyone, there's always going to be a point in your career where it's time to move on to something else and move forward, even if it's in the same area.
No, that definitely makes sense. And this might be kind of like a loaded question. I want to hear your perspective on it. When you're implementing these changes, do you think your degree in IO, or do you think it would have been different if you had like an MBA, or do you think like IO is such more of a benefit? Because I was wondering, as we kind of enter this corporate world, that we kind of said it before we started, not a lot of people know about the field of IO. Yeah. So when you're talking to these leaders, do they look at IO differently than maybe some other degrees?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people still don't know enough about it. That is the harsh truth. I think the MBA probably connects you a little bit more with being able to pitch better and like that whole business mindset, right? But if you're more human centric, IO is definitely for you. Like that is the value in IO, bringing the human centric value to everything. And humans are part of everything we do. We sell to humans, we service for humans, like we are humans, like everybody involved in every point in the organization is a human. Even if you have all these systems running things, there's a human backing it, right? And the human mind is the one that has to understand the way the systems connect in order to make the system work in a way that it needs to and give the developers feedback and all of that to make the improvements. So it really, really depends on what your values are in terms of which degree you go with. But of course, the MBA is more well recognized, but it doesn't mean that it's higher value per se.
I'm gonna piggyback off of that too, as someone who started in business and ended up in IO. Like the experience that I've had making that transition is a lot more, like you said, people focused. Mm-hmm. So like from the business side, there is that focus on people, but there's also like a big focus on profit, at least specifically from like a management perspective that I was in. And I did take like a couple like graduate level courses. Mm-hmm. And even in those, there was almost a formality to it that's different than when you're like discussing IO with IOs than if you're talking with people in business. And I learned a little bit from that. And that's kind of what also brought me here is I like the people side and I see that side with value, and I like the science behind IO. So you can kind of see the difference in like the mannerisms and the way people communicate. Like effective business writing is way different than like when you're pitching data in IO. Like it's all so different. Yeah. So it's a huge learning curve, I think, for people. But I also wanted to add, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, but most of the time when you're dealing with management and you're reporting to management, they probably don't even look to see if you have a master's in whatever you have a master's in. They look at your title. And I would assume that the title would probably be the thing that would be a driving factor for like how they respond to the information you're giving them, correct?
It depends. I think it depends on who your audience is, like everything else. But what I will add to, that particular portion of the topic is that IO for me, in the meshing of the business world, it brings the human part of the competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. If you've ever done network marketing, which I did, when I studied business, a lot of the times what really closed the sale, it was the relationship. Like they do teach you about business to business relationship management. There's a lot about customer centric and, business to business relationships and stuff. But when you understand psychology in the way that IO psychology teaches you, you really start to connect the dots and be able to help others learn about how big of a factor trust is and how to build it, right? What actually reduces that trust level? A lot of times in organizations, you'll see there's a morale issue. they've lost customer base based on trust. They don't quite know how to measure that, right? It's just they're measuring product satisfaction, customer service satisfaction, and it's like all these things lend themselves to some of the trust that they've lost, but they may never call it a loss of trust, right? And so it's like trust. Sometimes people came to me to purchase because they actually wanted to just connect. Like all of these human needs, you're filling so much more than just selling a product to a person and the need that that product fills at times. Sometimes it's human connection. Sometimes it's brand loyalty created because they trust the brand. And so IO psychology really helps you understand how to move those needles.
No, yeah, I definitely agree. And my my question never meant to bash the field, but I think it's an important distinction to have, especially for students looking for in graduate degrees to like see that difference between MBAs and IO psychology. And on the flip side, I've seen IO psychology really praised in some organizations because they bring what you were saying, that like motivation aspect. I forgot who we were talking to. Maybe it was our previous episode with Andre Martin, but the amount of money that organizations lose that when their employees are not engaged, or when they don't feel like the culture is a right fit for them. And I think as an IO psychologist, you can really, that's where you kind of like show your value, that people centric side to it with the support of the data. So yeah, I definitely agree with your answer. And it's,
I totally agree, and I think if you are even toying with the idea of IO psychology, you are going to be, you know, in this tug of war between the MBA and the IO psychology degree because you lean towards psychology because of something, right? But it's really you chose IO because you love business at the same time, So I think that you'll always have that tug of war between these two highly valued degrees that it's going to spark interest both of them for you. So like I said, it really depends on like what you want to do with it.
Yeah, and also too, I feel like both of them do a good job at touching on subjects within each field. So like I think IO does a good job at touching on like business and management and like other things like that. And in like a master's program specifically for like an MBA, like you'll probably see they touch on like IO stuff like organizational development or like sometimes even behavior. I took a behavior class, but it's probably a little bit more surface level than the IO stuff that we do. We take deeper dives in our master's program than at least the ones that I experienced when I was taking class too.
Well, we just dive more into testing the theories. Like,
Yep.
yeah, we don't just spot analyze. We actually have to like test it, retest it, go based on someone else's research. So, I guess you gotta kind of like science a little more.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to, before we get to our final question, I actually wanted to circle back, Jennifer, to a point you were making earlier about change management, and kind of just talk a little bit about your experience with that, because like you were talking about getting buy-in and then talking about the challenges that you have with change management. So what is that experience that you've had and what have you learned as an IO that like has helped you in those types of environments with change management?
The biggest thing that I feel like I learned in terms of change management is that everything is an intervention. Everything is an intervention. I can't even stress that enough. An email, the conversations you have with people. If you are trying to get something done, if you're trying to create and build a new culture around a new change initiative, if you are making a change that's impacting a lot of areas of the organization, and you really have to be committed to it. And so there's that trust factor again, right? And so if you say the wrong thing in an email, if you say the wrong thing in person and it spreads, you're taking that change 10 steps back. Like there needs to be a mindfulness and there needs to be a training on that. Like I feel like it's not common sense. It sounds so simple, right? But it's not common sense. You're not constantly thinking, okay, we're making this big org change, or we're really trying to focus on this particular area of a strategic plan or our mission and values. We want everything centered around it. I need to center everything around it. I need to show commitment at all angles, in all interactions within the organization. And maybe I should have an IO on board that should look at some of my communications before I send it, right? maybe we should do some priming beforehand. Maybe we should, reinforce. Maybe we should hold educational sessions to kind of bring things in and help people understand the value that it adds to them. There's so much involved in it. And that's why it's called change management, because you are managing the change throughout all aspects of the trajectory of the change. Any change management initiative in a large organization, they say it takes 3 to 5 years to actually happen. So that's a lot, right? Because your plan includes the plan of the change, right? And then every area that it impacts, you got to bring all those people in. So there's a lot of collaboration involved. Think about all the meetings that happen, all the conversations, all of the buy-in. First, you're collecting data. Like, essentially, as a change management agent, you want to collect the data first. So I started like my largest change management projects by doing things like interviewing different departments. Start with the head, whoever they want to bring in. And then that's a whole data collection research project in itself, right? You're bringing that back to the table with all the leaders, and you're crafting out the plan. And then you have the communication plan part, and then you're measuring it throughout and making tweaks and changes until you're set on something that works. And at the point in time where you're like, oh, something's working, guess what? The environment around you is changing. That's the business studies that teaches you. And sometimes you have to change your business model because the environment around you is changing. So that's another thing that you have to keep up with, right? Like, look at Netflix. Started off with DVDs and moved into the digital world. Those who didn't make those kind of business model changes, they flopped. So there's change happening to us. So we're either gonna, make the change happen, or it's gonna happen to us.
It can be a tough task because not everyone likes change. So when you're implementing these changes, I bet half the time is not convincing, but talking people through, like, this is what's going to happen, and like hearing their responses and trying to kind of make good with them. And I bet that can be a really hard task.
Challenge. That is the most underestimated time consumption of the job that leaders do not see oftentimes. You're managing people. You are managing people, but on a different level. You're not managing people just as a leader, as your staff. You're managing people in terms of their resistance levels, in terms of their engagement, all at the same time. And so it takes a lot of relationship management within that change management, and a lot of collaborative efforts. And you need to constantly be aware of the changes that are happening in their departments too. Again, that systems thinking, right? You can't forget part of your systems. It's easy to lose sight of one piece. There's too many moving pieces. So yes, it's very, very challenging because you are managing a lot of people.
Yeah, and even like when think about like something small, they're like, oh, we're just going to implement this new software. We want everyone to use Workday now, but your employees just got used to working Success Factors or some other human resources software. People like that they're got good at something, and then you tell them we have to change. I can't imagine having to break that news.
Or they're burnt out and they're like, I don't have time to learn something new. I don't have time to integrate everything that I'm doing into a whole new system. And so it's really, really important that they understand the time that it's going to save them later, that they're just putting the time in on the front end right now. It's temporary, but it'll save time along the way. So, you have to really be able to explain to them the time they're losing. And I did a lot of new system integrations and those kinds of changes. I was a system administrator for a few systems and platforms, and there is a lot. And then you have to build a whole support infrastructure for it as well.
Change is tough, and I feel like whether you're doing it at work or you're doing it in your own life, people really do struggle with change. And I mean, we're human, so obviously it's okay. Like, you just got to work through it, and communication is obviously a big factor in it. And it sounds like you play a big role in that, Jennifer, at work. But that is a good way to get to our last question of the day. So we always ask all of our guests this. It's just, what advice do you have for prospective IO students out there looking to join the field?
just get in there, speak to as many people as you can, expand your network. I wish I had done that sooner. I dove more into my work. I was fortunate enough to be able to do so. And if you can, do it as well, but make time for networking and speak to as many people as possible who are currently doing things that you even remotely are interested in, because maybe you don't know what you want to do at the time. But if there's one part of your class that you're like, oh, I really like that book, I really like that area of study, that class, speak to people. You'd be surprised at how many people seem to have very busy lives, high titles, but they wish they had someone to speak to and are more than open to speak to people.
You make a great point, Jennifer, because the cool thing about IO is that everyone who is in IO knows what it feels like that there's not a lot of other people in IO. So when you get talked to, or like you get emailed, like, can you talk to me about what you do as an IO and how you help prepare? They want to help because they've been in that position before. And we have such a niche field that is so big at the same time that there's always someone in a certain position that you could talk to that you want to do, whether it's something in HR or OD, consulting, and multiple other fields. There's always someone to talk to. And that networking piece really becomes vital.
Yeah, every conversation that I had, I was so grateful that people took the time to talk to me that had been already practicing in the field, because I picked up something from each and every one of them, even if it was just a new thought pattern or just hearing their experiences. So definitely.
Yeah, and LinkedIn is definitely a valuable resource as well, like first, second, and third connections. I know I'll just go on LinkedIn, and like whether we have someone on this podcast and we find someone for the show, or if it's for anything else, and you'll see like these people are connected with mutual connections, because IO is that small. So you never know who you know, and it's really good to utilize that network.
Yeah. How did you even find me? Because I realized we weren't connected.
Yeah.
You.
We just stumbled across your LinkedIn, and Joe and I were talking about this earlier, like when we were looking for guests. I don't even I don't even remember how it happened.
We just stalk. I actually I didn't even know this was a thing. I reached my limit on LinkedIn for how many people I could search up. So now whenever I type in IO psychology in the search bar, it's only 3 like search results, and everything else is blurred out, and then I have to pay for LinkedIn Premium.
I don't search.
There's no way. I didn't even know that was possible. I was
so well.
I know. Good thing we're booked up for the next couple of months, so then hopefully, in a couple of weeks it's back to normal.
Gonna be a few passes. Yeah, let's hope.
That you can tell we're putting in a lot of work.
I love it.
But Jennifer, it was so great to get to meet you. I'm sure we like saw you at Metro, but it's nice to actually get to have a conversation with you. It was really nice to see you, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you at more of the Metro events looking forward as well.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. So Joe, that was a really informational episode with Jennifer. I thought that there were so many good takeaways from that episode, but I think one of the coolest things that we learned is that like the idea of job crafting. We haven't really talked about that a lot on this show, but creating a position for ourselves and like learning how to instill IO into our work and to do what we want to do. We've briefly mentioned it, but to hear someone actually bring it up, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I definitely didn't know much about job crafting, and I feel like now I'm definitely more informed. I also loved her just perspective about being an IO in an organization and the value you can bring. She's definitely right. That data centric but more person valued perspective is super important to an organization that every IO should know about themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that you can kind of use the advice that she gave and learn from the experience she has to like try and create a role for yourself within your own organization and to be your own champion out there in the workplace. So I thought it was super valuable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you everybody for watching and listening, and we hope to see you next week.
See you guys.